Good afternoon, and welcome to our second panel of the day on identifying and serving at-risk populations. It's part of our emergency management week with our overall theme of 6 weeks of building a culture of preparedness. And before I introduce our moderator, I want to tell just a very brief story. When Irma was coming towards Fort Lauderdale, and we all evacuated to Orlando, which is, of course, where Irma eventually went. I have a part-time handyman, good kid, lives out close to the turnpike west of here. And I realized he probably didn't have any cash. So before going to Orlando, I went west to give him some cash. And while I was waiting for him to come down to the parking lot of his apartment, a cab pulled up. And in the cab, a lady got out. The cab driver was carrying two cases of ramen noodles, and they went to the door of a rather fairly low-income apartment building. Didn't look like it could withstand much of a storm. And a little boy came to the door, and it occurred to me that they were sheltering in place, and ramen noodles was going to be their sustenance for however long it took. And it hit me like a sledgehammer. I thought we really need to look at how to serve these at-risk populations, elderly, disabled, people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so this is a solutions-based conference. And I don't want to take too much steam, but at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, we have a bonus panel for an initiative that we are trying to do in Broward County, which is a tangible initiative to actually get the cities and the county aligned to do just that, identify at-risk populations and better serve them when a CAT comes. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jack Ellison, who is spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. as a member of the senior management team and senior vice president and treasurer for AARP, managing billions and billions of dollars. We aspire to hopefully get to those amounts one of these days, Jack. And he is retired to Florida and was selected by the board of directors of the Fair Foundation to serve as our chairman. So I want to introduce Jack Ellison.
Thank you, Jay. I hope the attendees and the panelists won't hold against me the fact that I'm from Washington, D.C. these days. Perhaps a sensitive subject. To begin, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just briefly introduce themselves, and then we can move quickly to the questions themselves. Can we begin with Teri? I see she went out. Curtis, how about you?
Good afternoon. My name is Curtis Brown. I'm the State Coordinator of Emergency Management at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, appointed by Governor Ralph Northam a couple of months ago, previously serving as Chief Deputy for 4 years. I've been in emergency management and Homeland Security for over 15 years on the federal, state, and local level. About 2 years ago, I co-founded a nonprofit, the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, focused on increasing diversity in the field of emergency management and integrating equity as a core component and goal of emergency management to reduce the disproportionate impacts of disasters on communities of color, marginalized communities, people with disabilities, and those who are most at risk of disasters. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Teri, could you say a few words?
Yes, sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Sometimes my screen just disappears. So I'm Teri Smith. I am currently the IAEM USA president until November, but my full-time job is I spent 24 years as a local director for Douglas County, Kansas Emergency Management. So, and then after that, almost 2 years ago, I switched to our local hospital, never thinking that I would be dealing with a pandemic. And so it's been from one, job to another, but everything is still the same, what we plan and train and prepare for. And populations have always been near and dear to my heart. I have a brother who is special needs and is unable to care for himself. So this is a very passionate area of mine to make sure that we are always inclusive of those that can't take care of themselves.
Thank you. Kevin, we know you have your hands full.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Guthrie. I'm the Deputy Director and State Emergency Response Team Chief for the Florida Division of Emergency Management here in Tallahassee, Florida. As you can see behind me, we're day number 12, I believe it is, on Hurricane Sally, and day number 201 on the COVID-19 response. The men and women behind me have been going solid straight for 201 days. So they're obviously getting a little worn out behind me, but they're still here, ready to go through the peak of hurricane season. 30 years public safety next month, 24 years being a former police officer and first line supervisor, went on to be a local EM director in a small rural county, and then into a what I would call a medium large county just north of Tampa, which had a lot of commuters that worked in the Tampa St. Pete area. And then before being asked by Governor Scott to come up and fill in a lame duck situation for about 3 months, and then being asked to stay on with Governor DeSantis. So very, very fortunate to be here. Look forward to the conversation. Appreciate the invite. Thanks, Jack.
Sure thing. And Gladys, last but certainly not least.
Hi, everybody. I'm the Director of Resilience and Disaster Recovery for the Florida Housing Coalition. We were a nonprofit organization, statewide organization. We've been around for about 30 years. We consider ourselves to be a catalyst to affordable housing, and we do that by providing technical assistance and training programs. We are the technical advisors for 121 local governments in Florida for everything from ending homelessness to disaster recovery. And we are the technical advisor for Florida Housing Finance Corporation, which provides about $500 million a year in different kinds of funding programs. So we advise nonprofit organizations and local governments. We have many publications on our website, flhousing.org. We have recorded webinars from our workshops, so there's a lot of training and information there to learn all about housing. Since Hurricane Irma, we've had a weekly webinar every Friday, 1:30, dedicated to disaster recovery so that we could update our members frequently and they wouldn't have to watch all the different webinars and blogs and things all week. So that has brought us into contact with experts from every aspect of disaster management, because we have guests every week. We have from meteorology to mitigation. And I feel that mitigation fits most into the mission of this fair conference for us as a year-round activity for housers and households to make their homes more resilient to natural disasters and climate-based change hazards. I can talk more about mitigation later, but we did just start a large ongoing series for mitigation. So we're going to be building a lot of training tools around mitigation.
Well, thank you, Gladys. Okay, well, let's start with your questions. The first one, frankly, is prompted by my interest in numbers. But I was informed that according to the Broward County Comprehensive Plan, about 10% of its population, or roughly 200,000 people, are estimated to have a vulnerability. And that would appear to be a fairly significant gap between the estimated vulnerable population and the approximately 3,600 people who have self-identified through vulnerable registry setups so far in the county. Now, I'm sure this, Broward doesn't necessarily speak for the state, but I'm sure there are similar discrepancies in the rest of the state. So my question is, how do emergency managers and local governments better identify vulnerable populations for pre-catastrophe evacuation and shelter and post-catastrophe recovery? And if you have an opinion, who do you think is doing a good job of identifying vulnerable populations? And anybody can answer this.
Oh, well, I think I still have my microphone on, but 20-odd% of the population has some kind of disability. We also have people that live in mobile homes and have all kinds of disabilities, that would need special attention during evacuation. My preference is always Pinellas County for best practices. They have a system where the people that register with special needs with Division of Emergency Management, which then funnels down to the county, they use their school buses and their schools to go around and pick people up who are registered. And they have a connection with the homeless shelters, and they go and pick up those folks to take them to the hurricane shelters. So I think they do a really good job of that.
Yeah, so Gladys, I'll pick up from that, and and that's not just centric to Pinellas County. That's actually a strategy used statewide. I agree with your assessment, Jack. It's definitely an we always struggle with getting people registered with special needs and the vulnerable population. There are a couple of counties, and I do not remember which ones they are. But I think one avenue that we could really probably help each other out with here is doctors' offices, private doctor's office, geriatric physicians, having some type of handout while they're in the office, and then they're diagnosed with a potential situation where they may need assistance. Being able to take a brochure, a handout, a flyer, back to Gladys's point of registering with the local emergency management agency so that they're notified. I think that is very, very important. I know I partnered with a couple of physicians in Pasco County and gave them the link to register for special needs. And there was a few physicians' offices that provided some specialty care, especially in the dialysis area and in some of our much more vulnerable electrically dependent populations. They actually help the individual register right there in the doctor's office. So I think it's got to be, as a best practice, I think the more that we can drive this down to a leave behind at diagnosis, or let me get you with one of my staff members in the office and let's do it right now, because you always have to take advantage of just in time, if you will, upon notification, there's an issue and get registered. But again, Gladys points out, every county and state in the state of Florida, all 67 counties underneath Florida State Statute 252 are required to assist in registering their vulnerable populations for special needs shelters. But I think we got to get to a point where somehow we get into the doctor's offices, physicians' offices to get them registered at a point of care.
Teri, Gladys, any additional comments?
Yeah, I think that it's really important too. I know some of you guys are a much bigger jurisdiction than maybe the area I'm at, but we really also reach out to our community living organizations that are with those individuals day in and day out and know. So looking at and conducting, a disaster vulnerability analysis to determine where your pockets of those individuals may be. But those community living organizations either have their clients, they've got them there, they're able to register them. They're a really good group, if you have them in your community, to really partner with to get them registered. Not everybody has to register. Also, our dispatch center has a program where if people have special needs, they can go in and in the dispatch, there's a section where they can register for what their special needs are. They can upload pictures that show, you know, it can be where, you know, they are non-English speaking, or they're nonverbal, or, you know, autistic, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of different partners that I think, but what's important is we've got to be able to pull all those together at the table and to talk to them and to work with them and get everybody together so that we're all on the same page and we're all working together. Because some of those people, you know, in your different organizations, they've got a lot of the resources and they know where a lot of those individuals are.
Anything to add, Gladys?
Well, I just, you know, wanted to throw out another bouquet of flowers to our Florida Division of Emergency Management, Kevin's group. These guys are my heroes. I mean, starting in March, they started preparing all the 67 county emergency managers for non-congregate sheltering during hurricane season. And so they were really busy engaging hotels and motel rooms for people that had to be isolated. And they set up a whole system within the shelters to do the PPE and so on. And so, you know, it takes that level of statewide preparing for that, and the congregate sheltering and the non-congregate sheltering is a really big deal now.
Yep. Yeah, and I know that Mr. Brown probably wants to chime in here, but Gladys, thanks for that shout out. You know, we got almost 500 hotels secured statewide for non-congregate shelters as we finish up hurricane season. And those non-congregate shelters are for persons with vulnerabilities, 65 years or older, potentially first responders that are going into an area where they need to isolate. But we've been able to partner with over 500 hotels statewide to do that. In fact, just recently for Hurricane Sally, we activated 6 hotels and about 150 hotel rooms to make sure that the vulnerable population was protected.
Curtis?
Yes, you know, I agree with the need to do a social vulnerability assessment and regularly do that to help identify where our at-risk communities are. We need quantitative and qualitative data. So connecting with the community associations, social justice organizations, community-based nonprofits, faith-based organizations, they know the communities best and are actually in many cases more trusted than government organizations. And so it's important to integrate them into our emergency management consistently. It takes more time and effort, but the benefits are great. And so, you know, that should be, to me, core to our emergency management functions moving forward. These partnerships with non-governmental entities, really community focused, really inside the neighborhoods to build positive relationships and trust.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next question initially to Teri, since she proposed it, but please feel free to chime in. What is the significance and challenge of tailoring messages to specific populations through a diverse range of communication modalities?
Well, I think one of the things is being able to tailor the message to the specific populations, because you're going to have a diverse range of communication modalities to ensure that those risk communications build your community capacity to respond effectively. So with that, you know, you have to look at the different types. You have to know your community. So you led into that first. You have to know your community. You have to know what kind of tools you're going to need to have, but you're going to have to build the trust, because a lot of those individuals already have things, you know, kind of fighting against them, let's say. And so building that trust before anything ever happened, and then knowing how you're going to be able to communicate with them. So going back to knowing who you are, knowing who you need to work with. So whether it be a community living organization, it's through your doctor's offices who know how to work with those people, and then you'll be able to tailor your messages with that. So because we want to be able to make it successful, but be able to motivate the people to do what we want them to do. So with that, you might have many different types of materials that you're going to need. Anything from larger print. You might have to have, you know, different types of just pictures. Some people don't understand even words, or we've got to keep it very basic. So it goes back to that whole hazard vulnerability and knowing what your community is. So then you can tailor your messages to fit your audience.
Thank you. Any other comments? Kevin, I can't but imagine that communication in your department is essential.
Yeah, Jack, it's extremely essential. I will tell you, you know, it goes back to either Teri or Gladys mentioned this before. The larger, you know, the larger the population, it gets more and more complex. You know, one of the things that we struggle here at the state with is, and I certainly would appreciate Curtis's opinion from Virginia, but when you get to state level government and you're providing communication for 67 different counties, and in each 67 different counties, you got multiple communities that I'm going to tell you right now, Kevin Guthrie doesn't know a whole lot about Jackson County and the rural makeup that Jackson County is and who the players are in Jackson County and et cetera, just by way of example. Take me to Jacksonville. I know all those very well because that's my hometown, but you know, being able to communicate has certainly has challenges across the spectrum for state government, because we are really dependent on that local level interface as we get ready to push messages downrange on the governor's behalf and the director's behalf, my behalf here. It makes it very difficult to communicate. And you know, I completely agree with Teri's assessment. Is, you know, you've got to have the capability to, you know, different languages, those that cannot read or write, you know, they can only take pictures. They can, you know, the gamut of communication modalities is just, you know, unthinkable, especially serving 21.5 million residents in Florida. It certainly gets very difficult. You know, we do the best we can. We reach out to that local level. We try to work within our Agency for Persons with Disabilities, senior living associations, things of those natures that may have a little bit better idea what's going on in this vulnerable population, this vulnerable community. But again, we are only as good at the state level as that local level interface that can help us navigate the waters at that local level of who we're trying to communicate with.
Understood. Curtis, what's your experience?
Sorry. Can I jump in a minute? And I also think that you need to make sure that, because he made me think of something, that consistent messaging. So as you build your, you know, network up of within your jurisdiction of all the different players, then you all are saying that same consistent message, and then people, it also builds the trust even that much more. So within your community, really working, and I know all of you that are emergency managers understand that it's all collaborative. And if we don't work together as a community, there's going to be a missing link, and we're gonna fail somebody, and that's the last thing that we want to do, especially with that vulnerable population.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And as Kevin mentioned, you know, this has been such a long response, COVID-19, and it's just a horrible, devastating disaster. What it has allowed us to do is to innovate as it relates to things related to equity, inclusive and accessible communication. We actually developed an accessible and inclusive communication guide for our state agencies and local partners that helps them to understand how to leverage tools like Zoom and all the other virtual capabilities, and leverage the tools that allow inclusive and accessible communication with people with disabilities. We've provided guidance on translation services, and also ensure that our press release and emergency communications are translated into the top 6 languages across the state. And so we continue to try to find ways in which to ensure that we're getting you know, culturally competent, inclusive emergency messaging out to our various communities across the state. And we've been doing that by partnering with organizations who have been helping us understand the unique issues of various communities and supporting us with our communication outreach efforts. So it definitely is a lot of lessons learned during this response, and we're going to take these lessons learned and make them a part of future disaster responses in order to be more inclusive and provide accessible communication moving forward.
Thank you. I'd like to take a little bit of a turn and make a little bit deeper dive into some of the subgroups of people that we consider to be vulnerable. Gladys, your question I thought was a good one, and I'd like you to respond to it. What is the most important facet of disaster preparation for assisting people experiencing homelessness?
Right, okay. Well, the ending homelessness system is very well organized. There's continuums of care throughout the country, and then they're county-based, and then there are all the organizations that do services for ending homelessness. And so the most important thing when preparing for that is the messaging with all of those different groups, and that they have a disaster response plan. And what they need to be planning for is how they're going to transport people. For example, if they're in a homeless shelter and they need to go to a hurricane shelter, we have several homeless shelters in the state that are in flood zones. And so those have to be evacuated. And they also need to figure out who can be staffing during the disaster, which staff people will be available, which volunteers will be available, because they kind of need to go with them to the shelters. There's a lot of myth busting that's needed about homeless people that go to shelters. And, you know, we've had experiences where they were yellow wristbands or, you know, put somewhere else or said, well, you're already homeless, you know. So a lot of that advocacy has taken place. That system's kind of cleaned up. But the main thing is that the messaging has to be there so that you can communicate with the shelter and with the people. And then you also need to be able to find the unsheltered homeless people that are on the street, and the people that the advocates know where they are and they can go find them and get them, but the messaging and the communication has to take place for that.
Would anybody else like to comment?
From a state level, it's homelessness it goes back to what I just said about the communication. You know, the local level has got to have really good eyes on this. You know, we at this here in Tallahassee can only be as good as our eyes and ears on the ground. So, you know, I encourage, county EM directors, and I know most of the 67 personally, since I came from that community. And, I know they care about that. They reach out, they work with advocacy agencies in their individual communities. But, from a state perspective, we're here to help. We'll certainly open up shelters. We'll open up, non-congregate sheltering if we have to, but it's certainly we're only as good as we're only as good as that first link in the chain. And I think this is what, maybe the bigger case here to the point of the series is preparedness, right? Everybody's got to be prepared down to that lowest common denominator, understanding that the homeless can't necessarily care for themselves. It's upon that homeless shelter to have a plan and to help tie into the bigger portions of emergency management, help them respond to and recover from a disaster.
And I think to expand a little bit on that too is, as much as we prepare and we plan for it, I mean, any of us can be vulnerable, considered a vulnerable population at any time. So, we're going to see an increase probably in homelessness throughout this. People, losing jobs, or, as a hospital, every one of our patients is vulnerable at this point because they're here because they can't take care of themselves. So we can, going back to his last comment, we can only do we can only do so much to a point, but we need everybody to help us out with that because it's an ever-changing demographics that we're dealing with when we're talking about vulnerable population within our communities.
Thank you. But the next question was posed by Brittany, unfortunately, who's not on at the time, but I think it's a good segue based on the last topic. And the question was, when we talk about vulnerable populations, often immigrant and undocumented communities aren't thought about, but are, of course, vulnerable groups. How do these groups impact disaster planning and response? And I'll leave this open to the first person who'd like to answer.
Well, I'll take the first stab at it if you don't mind, Jack. You know, we're dealing with this right now in COVID-19 testing. So, you know, I think many times in emergency management, you got to let the right lead agency take the right lead, right? And in this case, you know, we'll talk about the migrant farm population. It's just a natural fit for the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to help lead that charge, right? And I think we've got to be cognizant of, and to your point in the question, Jack, is undocumented individuals. You know, you don't want to send law enforcement out there. You don't want to send the Florida National Guard out there. You got to get creative in your response to be able to go out there and serve a community that's in need, help them out, make sure they're tested, make sure they're, if it's a hurricane situation, you know, we're dealing with this a little bit in Hurricane Sally right now, is making sure that you keep the security element at a distance. You're keeping those things that might hold off a community from coming out and taking advantage of services. You got to just change that up. For instance, you know, you shift from National Guard and local law enforcement to a private security guard that's in a completely different colored uniform for the security aspect of things. So, you know, those are just a couple of examples of things that we do here. But again, I like to get back to the point of, if you have a subset, such as, again, migrant farms or a specific population, Spanish-speaking Creole, whatever the case may be, is helping reach out to the right agency, reach out to the right group, reach out to the right liaison, and help them bridge that gap in between the response, the recovery phase, and that community. That's been a really good practice for us here in the division. And it's going to continue to be the way we do business because we've had quite a bit of success with it.
Great. Curtis, what would your recommendations or observations be on this topic?
I agree with Kevin, excuse me, that we have to be very intentional in terms of our outreach and understand that, you know, government doesn't have all the solutions. We have to partner with the organizations who are providing services, understand these communities, have built trust, and we have to take the steps to ensure that we're operating with the respect and cultural competence that can allow us to provide support. Instead of just rushing in and not being thoughtful, you know, who are we sending? It's not just the message. Message is also the messenger. We have to make sure we're partnering with the right folks, and in order to build trust. Because again, our main goal is to serve people, reduce the loss of life, injuries, and negative impacts. And so we just need to do it in a very smart way. There's a lot of examples historically when this has not occurred in emergency management, when we've just rushed out and not been thoughtful. And it puts us in a really horrible position, and again, it reduces trust for that next event because we weren't thoughtful in how we communicated and coordinated support for undocumented communities. So this is really core to how we more equitably integrate emergency management practices.
Thank you. Thank you. Any additional comments?
I just one follow-up, Jack. You know, Curtis mentioned something there, and I just want to kind of put the exclamation point on it. He said the sentence. I just wanted to put the exclamation point on it. But it reminded me, it doesn't always have to be government being the one carrying the message. As he alluded to, having the right advocate. Maybe the right advocate is the one that delivers a message and is the one that's up in front of the TV, the one that's up, you know, behind the microphone, if you will. It doesn't always have to be that government official. So again, Curtis hit that. I just want to make sure we drive that home. It's about having the right person deliver the right message with obviously the support, you know, of cast behind that individual saying, yes, the team is here, they're ready to support, but it doesn't necessarily have to be me. It doesn't have to be a director. Doesn't need to be a governor actually delivering that message. It's the right advocate for that particular environment. But I would be remiss if I didn't hone in on that as well.
Hi, and if I could jump in, this is Brittany Castillo. I'm grateful to join you all, and I joined at a perfect time. This question is something that's really important to me, and I agree with everything Curtis and Kevin said. I would just echo so that the community knows this is something that in our work, cities and counties are increasingly aware of. And I think a lot of communities along the border area are really thoughtful with the data and quantifying undocumented communities. And I would encourage everyone to think through, that undocumented communities, whether you're in cities or rural, are our critical community to consider as part of this conversation.
Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate that. We've been working our way through the list of questions that have been submitted by the participants, including one that you submitted on immigrant and undocumented communities. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
I would echo again what's been said by Curtis and Kevin, and that I encourage all cities, counties, communities to think through this issue. I think it's one that is now getting a lot of the attention it deserves, and I echo the sentiments have said on best outreach methods.
Thank you. We've been working our way sort of through some of the subsets within the vulnerable population. And Gladys, you submitted an interesting question. How do disaster managers address mobile home park residents, both at the time of emergency and in mitigation?
Yeah, mobile homes are kind of a special issue, especially in Florida. There's, when you look at kind of the vulnerability indicators, mobile homes are where senior citizens live. It's where lower income people with disabilities, and oftentimes people, the evacuation order is if you live in a mobile home, you must evacuate, even if the home isn't in a high wind zone. So there's that messaging part of it, but the programs we're working with is more during blue skies, and that is that it's a mitigation effort that older mobile homes should be replaced with newer modern manufactured housing, even anything pre-1994. That's when the codes started to get better, but there's a lot of programs to brace mobile homes, to tie them down, put window film on them, carport stabilization. Again, to Kevin, Florida Division of Emergency Management, they have operated a mobile home tie down program for years. It's very, very successful. The waiting list is several years long though, so we just need to continue to focus on that to make those homes safer.
Yeah, so thank you, Gladys, again for that shout out and segue. The mobile home tie down program has been something that's been successfully run through the Tallahassee Community College for the state of Florida as a part of in conjunction with our hazard mitigation section for as long as I can remember. But that's a program that every year the money goes very quickly and is used in its entirety. But I do agree, just a couple of observations about, the mobile home industry. As Gladys said, 1994, the standards change on this exponentially on mobile homes, and they continue to get much better through time. However, it's been my experience as a local EM director at the county level in 3 different counties that there comes a break point. Usually I have found about 15 years where the vulnerable population and or the senior community lets their insurance lapse and they let it go. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, and I may be off by a couple of $1,000s, but I'm not too far off. The average payout for a disaster survivor victim in the state of Florida is about $4,500 through FEMA. If you're an uninsured individual homeowner, like a mobile home, the most you're going to get is about, or I shouldn't say the most, the average payout's about $4,500. If you qualify for every single program and you maximize the benefit through FEMA in their uninsured situation, the maximum you get is about $36,000, give or take. And I don't know very many people that can rebuild a life after a mobile home, or any home for that matter, is destroyed on $36,000. But that is the absolute maximum amount of money that is going to be paid out. Those are some staggering statistics, especially when you consider the number of hurricanes that hit Florida, that our average across the state is about 4,500 in payouts. So, you know, I know that seniors have to make a very, very tough decision between medications, and other type of issues. But, you know, typically some of these insurance related issues, is especially on manufactured mobile homes, is obviously pennies on the dollar. And if you get hit by that hurricane and it takes away everything from you, not having an insurance policy on it's really going to hurt at the time. But so Jack, I'll turn it back over to you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If I could just put one more point of that, after Hurricane Michael, there were a lot of mobile homeowners who lost their homes, and Florida is lucky we have a state housing trust fund, and that those funds are pretty flexible, and so they've been using those to replace mobile homes, which is around an $80,000 hit. So yeah, you know, it's the housing programs can handle it if the trust funds are there, but we have a long way to go. We have so many mobile homes in Florida that, you know, haven't been treated at all.
Understood.
And I think to expand on that a little bit is, you know, to work with your zoning and codes department to get some things maybe done differently. Here, you know, we deal with a lot of tornadoes. And so working with those mobile home parks to have them have storm shelters, and making some changes in policies. It might make, you know, for them to have a little bit more, and it might cost maybe a little bit more in lot rent or something like that, but it's going to make us more safe and secure environment for those people that need to take shelter.
Thank you. The next question I'm going to direct to Curtis, who wins the award for the longest question submitted. I appreciate that. But here it is. The words in terms of vulnerability and vulnerable communities are used in the field of emergency management, usually to describe communities of color and underserved communities. But no context is given to fully explain the root causes for why the vulnerability exists in these communities. Based on your professional experience, what are the root causes of vulnerability within at-risk communities?
Jack, that's a great question.
Of course it is.
I think you have to look back. It was mentioned, I think, by Teri about the planning division, you know, across the country. You know, we have a lot of policies, and again, there's a lot of research out there that shows that these policies, such as redlining, which was systemic denial of services from the federal government, state and local governments, that essentially created communities, empowers communities, largest communities of color. And those communities still exist today, where you have a congregation of people who are in poverty. The infrastructure is crumbling, and these communities are barely surviving on a blue sky day. And so when pushed to the limits with a disaster, they're going to be the same communities that are going to need the additional support. So if we trace the issues related to redlining, environmental justice, these communities are most likely in the flood zone, or have toxic chemical plants located in and around it because they've been allowed to be located there. There's a stretch in Texas called Cancer Alley, where it's a large, about 150 industrial plants and refineries, along with a large community of communities of color in that area. And so the cancer rates are very high, and it's directly related to the co-location of those plants in those communities. And so when we look at the root cause of this vulnerability, we can hopefully be empathetic. We have cultural competence. We'll understand where the lack of trust comes in at. And we can also guide our mitigation strategies to hopefully untangle these inequities that have been built in and exist because of past inequities that exist, that have modern day impact. There was actually an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that documented Richmond, Virginia, one of our public housing communities here in the city of Richmond, and it was talking about, it's a red line community, that we have data and documentation. The University of Richmond did a really good study on all of our red line communities across the state, and Richmond was one of them. And so this housing project was developed, during the 50s, 60s, during that time, and they've been able to trace elevated risk of heat-related emergencies to that community. So we know that every year it keeps getting hotter and hotter. Folks low income do not have some places do not have adequate air conditioning, et cetera. We do not have vegetation and greenery. And so what we're doing is we're mapping our communities based on this red line data and saying, hey, let's use the FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program to dedicate a mitigation project to build resilience in these areas that have been made vulnerable because of inequitable and systemic and structural racist policies from the past. And so I think we really need to understand where some of this vulnerability has come from. It has come from a lot of these policies, and that can hopefully guide our mitigation resilience policies to hopefully address these systemic issues.
Thank you.
Jack, I want to pick up where Curtis left off and give a little bit of a Florida perspective on this. First of all, I completely agree with everything that Curtis said. And the second thing that I want to do, and this is going to take a little bit of twist off of his question and go to maybe the next level. Back in a few years ago, Florida state statute, the legislature came together and made a recommendation. It ended up being a recommendation, not a actual mandate, but it was recommended that all coastal counties in the state of Florida create at the local emergency management level a local post-disaster redevelopment plan. And I think that is extremely important to address a lot of the issues that Curtis just came up with. Again, going back to the local level, I haven't had the opportunity to do this much at the state level, but in Pasco County, I had an area that was full of blight, underserved communities, so on and so forth. And while we never want anything to happen bad to a community, we had made plans in Pasco County through the post-disaster redevelopment plan. We were one of those counties that chose the recommendation and went ahead and developed that, what we call here a PDRP. And we were able to, if that big one ever came, or that tornado ever came, we had a planning division that got together and said, here's how we're going to create affordable housing, better affordable housing. We're going to revitalize this area, and here's how we're going to do it on a step-by-step basis. This is what we're going to bring there. Some type of travel sports type situation where you bring tourism into that area, help that area get on its feet while also serving the underserved community. So I think, especially in Florida, if there's anyone on this panel, or not panel, but that's watching this from the state of Florida, I cannot overstate how important that post-disaster redevelopment plan can be and how it can be used to talk about the things that Curtis just mentioned. It gives a clear set of instructions and guidelines on how you're going to get that taken care of to where you take care of your vulnerable population.
Jack, if I could jump in, I think the conversation Curtis and Kevin are having is really valuable because it's broadening the scope. Think of how we think about vulnerable populations and vulnerabilities in our community. And I would encourage those listening to do that. I think our industry sometimes around vulnerable populations can be really narrowly focused on the immediate pre-planning and immediate response, those first 72 hours. So we're talking sheltering, we're talking food, ice, water, immediate threats to life and property. And certainly that's critical. But I really would encourage, and the people in this room, both the public and private sector, to think through vulnerabilities broadly. So Curtis and Kevin touched on a lot of that mitigation. I'll take that another step and think about the recovery, but the longer term recovery. So a month out, 3 months out, 6 months out, a year out, those communities are still in tremendous need. And I would argue that those vulnerabilities are exacerbated. We know that disasters disproportionately impact vulnerable communities, women, senior citizens, elderly people, in the communities we're talking about. But I don't know that our response follows it out 3 months. So there was some great conversation about effectively communicating with these communities. Let's think through doing that 3 months out, 6 months out. And I'll end by saying a lot of the funds, a lot of the money that's flowing from the federal and state into the community level is coming out 3, 6, 9 months later, whether that's housing, whether that's other, small business loan funds. And so we need to really do a good job at tracing those communications in the long term with vulnerable populations.
No, thank you. And incidentally, that was essentially the next question I was going to move to, and you've answered it very well. Thank you, which you authored. We're beginning to run close to our time limit because questions are coming up at 3:50. Brittany, there was one question that we discussed on the phone that I'd just like you to take a moment to elaborate on it. And it was something that really hadn't occurred to me, but how might pets impact how we think about vulnerable populations?
Absolutely. This is, I think, another interesting topic. And I believe it was Teri that earlier said that we can, any of us could be vulnerable population at any moment. And I think that thinking about pets really hammers that home. People with pets might not choose to evacuate. And I don't think we always do a good job at including that segment of our population when we're thinking about vulnerable communities. So 2 very brief examples. A hurricane coming into South Florida, you might see people make different choices due to where they can take our pets. And I think we're doing a good job of thinking through including pets in our sheltering options, but we certainly can do more, communicate with vets, humane societies to get that message out. On the other end, livestock and agricultural animals. So California, this came up when we were doing work with the wildfires. People might not choose the actions that are planning. We put people in lanes and, in order to create our community plans. So I would challenge you to think through how pets impact people's behaviors.
Any other observations from the other panel members?
I agree with Brittany on that, Jack. We see that all across the state of Florida. If you do not make a plan or you do not provide an opportunity for a person to evacuate with their pet, at least take it to the same shelter, even though the pet and the owner may be separated, then you're not going to get a person to evacuate. You have to provide that opportunity in order to be successful. There's no other way to do it. And then I will say at the local level, if there's any local emergency managers, state or nationwide that are listening to this, the most important relationship you can have and build at the local level is the one with your school board superintendent. I was very, very fortunate to have 2 great school board superintendents where I worked. And I remember Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Irma came over Pasco County as a Cat 2 hurricane. Kurt Browning, who is the superintendent of schools who is the school board superintendent for schools in Pasco County, he said when he saw the lines wrapped around and he saw the people with their pets, and we were out of pet-friendly shelters and we were out of special needs shelters, he declared that all 27 schools inside of Pasco County were all pet-friendly and all special needs, and he opened the doors to them. That's the kind of leadership and that's the kind of stance you have to take to be successful. So to this day, I appreciate my relationship with Kurt Browning and his ability to get that kind of stuff done.
I think that's pretty extraordinary. Cindy, Beth, do we have any questions at this point for the panel members? I noticed it's about 3:51.
Hi, yes, we have a couple of questions, but first I just want to thank everyone. This has been such an insightful panel on such an important issue that's going to continue to be extremely important as we see the long-term effects of coronavirus on our vulnerable populations and communities. To begin, we have, as of now, 2 questions. I encourage anyone who has a question to go through and put one in either the Q&A or the chat function. I'll read it regardless. But this is the first one I received from Stephen. What's the panel's thoughts on using faith-based organizations to identify vulnerable populations within and outside their organizations in concert with emergency managers?
I'll just start by that I think, there's a lot of opportunities for us to reach out within our community. So a faith-based organization also knows a lot of those that are vulnerable. So it never hurts to bring them into the planning phase to really figure out where some individuals are. Plus, they many times are the ones that are going to help you with sheltering, or they're going to help you with having serving food and different things of that sort. So faith-based is an important component when you're talking about not just vulnerable populations, but your populations and helping and assisting in times of emergencies and disasters.
Yeah, and I'll add to it. I'm sure Curtis is probably going to say something similar or maybe a little bit different, but that oftentimes that pastor, that priest, that bishop, that elder that person is going to know better the local community issue around that that sanctuary than even the city leaders are going to know. We use that often. In fact, again, Hurricane Sally right now in Escambia County, there's a church that is taking care of the Brownsville community, and that pastor knew his community. He knew who was around it. He knew who had problems, who were electrically dependent, who were on kidney dialysis, et cetera, et cetera. So they, you know, in our EOC behind me here, we got a room that is what we call the Bible Belt, and you know, with a belt buckle on it, and they certainly know the community very, very well that they serve.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. It was 2017, but after Hurricane Maria, when we had thousands and thousands of people evacuating from Puerto Rico, a lot of them ended up in Central Florida, and then as they were placed or they went back and they got rental housing, a lot decided to stay here. But we ended up with kind of the most difficult to serve at the end of it, and FEMA was done, and you know, it went on, but it was the faith-based organizations in Osceola and Kissimmee that really took care of that last population of people that were still living in the motels. So, I mean, they're just critical.
I would just say, emergency management is all about relationships and connecting with the faith-based community, continuing to build that relationship is so essential and important that we have to do that continuously. And again, it goes back to trust. Communities, a lot of communities will trust the faith-based entity before they trust government, and that's well-founded and that's understandable. And so it's really important for us to work with them and partner with them and to integrate them into our whole cycle of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. They really are an essential partner for how we're able to respond when that bad day occurs.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that question? If not, I'm going to move on to the second one. Okay, so the next question we got from Lori is, in this current political climate, do you see and/or anticipate that there would be a hesitation in registering for these services, particularly for those that don't speak English as a first language? How do you incentivize them to register?
So I'm going to just start out with, you know, something my director says, and I say on when asked something on this question about the politics of it. You know, nobody is denying that a Cat 4 hurricane hit Southwest Louisiana right now, and nobody's denying that a Cat 1 hurricane, Cat 2 hurricane hit Pensacola, Gulf Shore, Alabama right now. COVID has become a completely politicized type disaster, and depending on what side of the fence you're on, it either doesn't exist and it's, you know, one thing, or it completely exists and many people are going to die from it. That's not for us as emergency managers to get involved in that. Our job is to respond to the situation and protect the community. In this case that we're talking about today is protect the vulnerable community. I think that we've got to do everything within our power. If that's a testing strategy, a vaccination strategy, a mitigation strategy through PPE, et cetera, it's our job to respond. And, you know, we in the state of Florida have millions of masks, millions of gloves, millions of gowns ready to respond and continue to do the things that we need to do to protect, and especially for this particular panel, the most vulnerable population. And we are going to be committed to that. As long as we need to be committed to that. The state of Florida has spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars on preparing for and responding to COVID-19 and ensuring the most vulnerable population will be protected. That's our stance. We're always going to have that stance regardless of political opinion. And, you know, I'm just happy to serve with the men and women behind me that are committed to that and don't let politics get in the way of it.
I would add, I think I think whether it's a natural disaster, a pandemic, a terrorist event, a lot of the points go back to what was said on this panel of community, relying on the community and faith-based partners and the type of messaging. And so I think, to Kevin said, is, you know, the emergency management community needs to do their job regardless of the politics, but we can thoughtfully engage given the current climate. And an example I think is fantastic is in Collier County, Florida, in order to reach the farm worker community, they used a government, they were having trouble getting the messages out and really kind of hitting their wall on how do we effectively engage this community. And they put a loudspeaker on a government vehicle and went driving through the communities, which was something reminiscent of what a lot of this farm worker community might have seen in their home countries. And my understanding is that it was incredibly powerful for government to engage and get the message across. So again, I think regardless of the political climate, how do you engage with the people you need to reach?
Brittany, thank you very much. That's pretty insightful. Low tech, but apparently effective.
Thank you. We got one more question. This is from Jamie, and I think it'll probably be the last question we have time to answer. What is the panel's thoughts regarding mental illness in regard to vulnerable populations and emergency management? For example, many people who suffer from extreme anxiety issues may not be willing to evacuate, knowing they would be placed in a very high anxiety situation.
I'll start with, you know, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but you know, this was very big for the governor of the state of Florida, as well as the First Lady and the director of the Division of Emergency Management. We now have the first ever in the United States state mental health coordinator that is assigned to the Florida Division of Emergency Management during disasters. That was groundbreaking. It was, you know, it was innovative. To our knowledge, and we polled FEMA administration. They did not know of any other state that had that. So that again talks about the commitment that Florida has to the to the issues that center around mental illness and mental health. So, you know, whether it was the NAS Pensacola shooting we had earlier this year, Hurricane Isaias that we rolled out our mental health coordinator on, she's involved at every single step of the way to help coordinate mental health resources and assets. And I think Florida being a leader in that is only going to continue to develop and flourish in the ability to let people know we are committed to mental health issues. And we're going to continue to help people as they're in their time of need, whatever that mental illness is.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other responses? Well, it looks like we're basically out of time at 4:01. I'd like to take the time to thank all of you for taking your valuable and precious time to appear on the panel and answer these questions. I believe everyone who's tuned in has learned a great deal. I certainly have. And hope to be able to engage in future conversations like this as we go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you too, Jack. Everyone watching, thank you to you. I just want to encourage you guys to tune in again tomorrow at our 1 o'clock session, Evacuating and Sheltering During a Pandemic, and our 3 o'clock session covering our Get Ready Broward initiative, which is the Fair Foundation's proposal to help address vulnerable populations. So thank you to everyone and the speakers. I know you all are very busy, and we appreciate your work and your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.